So we want to begin our study in the Gospel according to John. I'll right into it. Let me ask you, who's the author of the Gospel according to John? John? John who? John the Apostle. Okay, because there are multiple Johns. How do we know he's the author of John? Does it say he's the author? Is that John the Apostle, or which John is that? A man sent from God whose name was John. That's John the Baptist, the baptizer, right? And who leads the way, prepares the way for Jesus. There are multiple Johns. There's John the Elder from Ephesus. There's John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And, of course, there's John the Apostle. John's a very common name. The interesting thing is that we believe and know it to be written by John the Apostle, and I certainly believe that. But we want to be able to strengthen our belief by some fact. And nowhere in the Gospel does it say that John wrote it. Nowhere. Matter of fact, John isn't mentioned, the Apostle, in the Gospel. His name doesn't exist in there. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons and one of the primary evidences that we feel like John did write it. How do we know John did write it? Well, let's look in John chapter 21. John chapter 21, verse 24. Somebody want to read that out loud for us?
This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true.
Thank you, Russ. This is the disciple who testified these things and know these things, and we know his testimony is true. To testify refers to his eyewitness account. Let me say this. The most important thing about the authorship of the Gospel of John is the eyewitness account, the testimony that we are told of, okay? But notice it doesn't say who the eyewitness account is from. If we really want to understand who it's from, what we probably need to do is a little bit of deductive work and back up. Somebody has something they want to say? Look in for a moment. Let's add this. Who is the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John? John? Yeah, we don't know that. It doesn't say that. We believe it to be John. I certainly believe it to be John. I'm not going to question that. There's no doubt in my mind it is the Apostle John. But it doesn't say that. If we look at the beloved disciple and learn a little bit about the person, we find that he's not even mentioned until John chapter 13, which is John chapter 13 and verse 23. There he leans on Jesus' bosom, which Peter asked him. Jesus had said, one of you will betray me. This is when they're having their last supper, their meal together. And Jesus says, one of you will betray me. Peter turns over to who? To the beloved disciple, who's leaning upon Jesus' breast and says, you ask him, who is it? Right? So that's the first mention of the beloved disciples in John chapter 13. The next mention is over in John chapter 19, when the beloved disciple is at the crucifixion with Jesus' mother, Mary. Also interesting, Mary's never mentioned by name in the gospel either. She's also mentioned twice in John chapter 2, which we'll get to another day, and here in John chapter 19 as the mother, but she never mentioned by name. John the Apostle is not mentioned by name. But there is the disciple whom Jesus loved with Mary, and he says, what does he say? What are the words? This is, behold your mother, and behold your son. Does it say son? I don't remember now. I think that's what it is. So that's the next mention. The next mention is in John chapter 20 and verse 2, when the beloved disciple outruns, races, and beats Peter to the tomb after Mary Magdalene had come and told him about the empty tomb. The next place is in John chapter 21, where the one who recognizes Jesus on the shore, remember they're out in the fishing boat fishing? In John chapter 21, and the one who recognizes, they see a guy out there and says, cast your net onto the right side. And what do? They catch 153 large fish. And the one who recognizes the one on the shore as Jesus is the beloved disciple. And of course, Peter then girds himself and dives into the water and moves on. And of of course, we have the reference again in John chapter 21, in verse 20, when 21, when Jesus is speaking to Peter about, whom do you love me? You know I love you, Lord. 3 times he does this, and then afterwards, Peter says to Jesus, what about this one? And the author tells us that he's talking about the beloved disciple. So that's the references to the beloved disciple. And it is the beloved disciple who is the author. And that's what it's talking about in John chapter 21, verse 24, or 20, verse 24. 21, 24. How do we know it's John? Let's look at John chapter 21, verses 1 through 2, and we do it by process of elimination. In John chapter 21, here they have been in the boat, or they're getting ready to go in the boat. It says, verse 21, after these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee is also known. And he manifested himself in this way. And notice who's there. Present Simon Peter, and Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other of his disciples were together. So we have Simon Peter, we have Thomas, we have Nathanael, we have 2 sons of Zebedee, and then so that's 2 sons of Zebedee, and then 2 more unnamed disciples. And it's in this chapter which the eyewitnesses. So logic would say that it's one of these 7. Is it Peter? That's a yes or no answer. No. Why not? Huh? He's already mentioned. He's not only already mentioned, he's mentioned in light of speaking to the beloved disciple. So it can't be speaking of himself. He's talking to the beloved disciple in many cases. So is it Thomas? Why is it not Thomas? That's a very important point, David. Thank you. David notices that Thomas is named in the gospel, where the beloved disciple is not named. The author took an approach in writing that doesn't name all 12 disciples. In the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a list of the 12 disciples, but not in John. Closest we come to it is in John chapter 1, and it's not even a list, and it's not all 12. Judas isn't named there. Judas is named much later. And John is never named in there, as several other disciples are never named. John doesn't present a list of disciples. That's not his function or his purpose in telling the story of Jesus' life on this earth. So for someone's name to be mentioned and then to be referred to later on in the chapter in important sections of the ministry of Jesus in his lifetime, for someone to have been named, such as Thomas, then to all of a sudden be referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved, it really doesn't fit well, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Some people believe, for example, that Lazarus is the beloved disciple. It says that Jesus loved Lazarus, and so some people want to say that Lazarus is the beloved disciple. Well, that's doubtful for several reasons. One, if we look at John chapter 12, the Jews decided that they wanted to kill Lazarus. I suspect they probably were successful. We don't really know. But secondly, again, Lazarus is named. Why would a person named early in the gospel then refer to themselves as the beloved disciple? It's not a literary function that makes sense. The same thing with Nathanael. Nathanael is named. Peter is named. These are not people that are most likely the beloved disciple. It does not literarily make sense. Then you got the 2 sons of Zebedee, right? James and John. So could it be James? Okay, if James was still alive when this was written. James was not alive when this was written. Not a chance. Because James was killed, if we look in Acts chapter, I forgot now, in the book of Acts, Apostles, James was beheaded, the apostle. Remember early on, the first one? And so by the time the Gospel of John was written, James was not alive. That leaves John. Then we have 2 other unknown disciples. Not a high probability, not an impossibility, but not a high probability that some 2 disciples that are just not even, there's no indication of who they even might be to all of a sudden be the beloved disciples. the probability that it's John is the apostle is the highest among all the different possibilities. And so we believe it to be John the apostle for several reasons. Let me point out a couple of other points. The best solution is John, number one, he was one of the 12 early on. Not only one of the 12, he was part of the inner group. Remember? Now, John doesn't speak to this, but the Synoptic Gospels do. He was with the three inner group. Who were the three? Peter, James, and John, right? Well, we already said it's not Peter because Peter's speaking to the beloved disciple. Could it be James? No, we already said James is dead. Who's that lead? John. So one of the inner disciples, the inner circle there, had the closest relationship, not only leaned on the bosom of Jesus, but the closest relationship in many ways in that eyewitness testimony that has penetrating insight to Jesus. Those three were present at what? The Transfiguration. Those three were present during the Garden of Gethsemane. The others were further away. Now, surely those three fell asleep 3 times during that prayer that Jesus did there. But the logic shows that the closest one would be John the Apostle. I'm sorry? John is first follower. I don't remember if it was John the first one. Now, in the Gospel of John, it doesn't depict that. In the Synoptics, it does. I don't remember who the first one is, if it was Andrew or John or James. It wasn't Peter. I don't remember, so we can look at that if somebody wants to look at it. Also, when you think about in the Synoptic Gospels, who has the closest relationship with Peter? God. Everywhere Peter is, John is. And the book of Acts, who has a very close relationship with Peter? Especially early on in the book of Acts. John, right? Who are together? Who were arrested together before the 12 were arrested? John. There's a very tight and close relationship normally.
You mentioned that this adds up at 7. In my book, it italicizes the word sons of the 70.
Right.
As if it's just of 70. So could it be, you said one had already passed, so by implication, maybe John is the only me. I'm just saying that, I'm just helping you to eliminate one of the suspects.
Understand that, thank you. Understand that we're looking at both when the event actually occurred, right? When they're in the boat with Jesus on the shore. And we're also looking at John writing this several years later. Okay? So when the event actually occurred, James was alive. But when John wrote it, James was not alive. So, and so could it be that there are more than 2 sons of Zebedee? I don't even know. However, the entire gospel is focusing on those 2. For all of a sudden to be something different would be out of the not plausible.
I see what you're saying now. You're just saying he could not have wrote it.
He could not have been the writer of the Gospel of John because he had passed. Correct. I think the other point I want to mention that there's a close relationship between Peter and John. If you want to go into history, the early church leaders clearly all accepted John as the author, and there's so much more in that. I don't know if I'm going to spend more time with that unless someone has questions. I think we're all comfortable with. There's a lot more detail in that regard to authorship. Let's talk a little bit about the dates of when John was written. I don't know that it matters greatly. There is some significance to it. Some believe, not many anymore, believe that it was written very early, around the time as the Synoptic Gospels were, in the early 60s, 60 AD. Most people don't accept that anymore. Most people think it was probably written in the late 80s or 90s time frame. And I personally feel that that's the most probable time frame it was written. Now, during the, let's call it the Enlightenment period, the 1700s, 1800s, and even early 1900s, the strong belief was that it was written late in the 2nd century, or mid to late in the 2nd century, because John has a lot of what we call this dualism, right? Below and above, light and darkness. And that was very popular in that late 2nd century period. And so people try to make that connection. That was debunked and put away, especially when they found called P52, a little fragment of a manuscript that's from John chapter 18. I think verses 31 to 33 on one side, verses 37 to 38 on the other side of that, clearly attested to be shown to be written around 115, 110 AD as a copy of the original, which means it was written sometime before that. So more than likely, John was written sometime before he died, if we believe he's the author. Now, when did John die? Well, John couldn't have died in 60-something, because if he wrote in much later, and most attest that he wrote much later, more than likely John died, matter of fact, the witnesses or testimony is he died around 98 AD. During the reign of Jerome, who wrote much later. Jerome is that guy that did the translation of all the New Testament and the Old Testament into Latin. Took the Greek and made it Latin, took the Hebrew and made it Latin. That's where they got the Latin Bible. Actually took the old Latin and made it a new Latin, kind of like old King James into a new King James. He did the same thing for the Latin. And he testified that John died during the 68th year of Trajan, who was the emperor of Rome. Well, when Trajan was 68 years old, that was AD 98. Before that, another church leader, Irenaeus, who was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John, testified that John was the author, and that he died, and then he wrote John, and he died in the 90s. More than likely, if you look at the timeline and you look at the text of John, there's a lot of support for John having written this very late in his life. As he wrote Revelation very late in his life. He wrote Revelation during Domitian's reign when he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Domitian's reign was from 81 to 94 or 5. And that's when he wrote, while in exile in Patmos, and that's when he wrote the book of Revelation. After that, there's a year of Emperor Nerva, from 96 to 98. And then from 98 onward is Trajan. So what I'm trying to say is that more than likely he wrote it later. And when we go through the Gospel of John, we'll see it has a lot of Jewish images. And the reason this has some significance, the only reason it really has any significance, is who John was writing to. Was he writing to people who were already Christians, or was he writing to people that he wanted to become Christians? Most believe, when you look at the Jewishness of John's writings, talks about a lot of Jewish images throughout the Gospel. It's very strong in that regard. And most believe that he's writing to a lot of Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Tried to show them who the true Messiah is. And there's some evidence for that. That's the only reason it might have some significance. As we study the Gospel of John, we'll see all this great Jewishness that he brings out in the Gospel. He doesn't quote a lot of Old Testament, I think about 12 times, which is nowhere near what's quoted in the Synoptics. But the imagery he uses is much greater than in the Synoptics. And we'll see that. He talks about these water pots for purification. He talks about other images throughout that being lifted up. While they're being lifted up goes back to when in Numbers 21, when the serpent was lifted up on the bronze pole, and which people had been bitten by poisonous serpents because of their disobedience to God. And they lifted up the serpent on the bronze pole, and ultimately they look upon it on the pole and they'd be healed from the poisonous serpent. So much imagery that's used that most people believe that they're just trying to reach out to the Jewish community. Is that real? I don't know. I think it's a good possibility. And I think that's the reason we see so much Jewish imagery. Does it really make a big difference to us? Probably not.
I think John 23 verse is what you're saying. That part is right, which not believe all the signs, not believe is the Son of God.
John John 20, 30 through 31. And we're going to go to that next. Thank you for bringing that, where we deal with the different themes. Or well, let me talk about the purpose first. But John 20 through 31 points to actually purpose. That's where we're going. What is the purpose of the writing? Why did John write it? Especially if he wrote it late. Even if he wrote it early, why did he write it? We got to read others. Why did he write the Gospel of John? He was not the first one to write. Mark was probably first. Then Matthew and Luke. So it seems that John came afterwards. What for? What's the purpose? Tim just mentioned John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. Let's look at that very quickly. In John chapter 20, verse 30, it says, "Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." John wrote this book because he wanted those who heard the message, to read his writing or hear his writing, including us, to believe. To believe what? Jesus is the Christ. Now, the point that Tim was making is, what would the word Christ mean to anyone who wasn't a Jew? Nothing. They don't know anything about the Christ. To a Jew, the Christ, the Messiah, had significance. So the point is that he's quite possibly writing to Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem who felt displaced and looking for the Messiah. And so I think that's a valid point. And so as I read through John, I sort of see that over and over. How does that apply to us? The same way it applies that we just read. These have been written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That you might have eternal life. We'll get to things, we'll touch on those as well. The interesting thing about this belief is one of the themes that's in here is belief. You know, the verb belief is 98 times used in the Gospel of John. 98 times. Now, it's important to see that a verb has, in this case, an action to it. There's, I believe. Well, there's some action associated with that. But you know what's not used in the Gospel of John? Is the noun form. Belief is. That's the noun. Well, it doesn't talk about it. The noun is never used. Only the verb. Indicating that there's an expectation for us to do what? Take action to believe. And so he writes it in such a way that it's intended to show belief. One of the amazing things about the Gospel of John is it really is a story of belief and how belief sort of either is planted and grows, and it shows the growth. We're going to talk about when we get to signs here in a moment. Or belief may be planted, and think of Judas. Now here's a guy that spent the same period of time that the other apostles did with Jesus. And he saw the signs that we're going to talk about that we just read in John chapter 20, in verse 31 and 30. He saw the signs, but yet he did what? He did at one time believe, but his belief didn't grow. Instead, his belief was focused not on the glory of God that the signs were intended to provide, or did provide. Instead of focusing and recognizing what the signs were pointing to, instead, he saw what he wanted to see, which was this earthly manifestation of a king. And that he would get a position from, or some benefit as a result. And so his belief never grew. What happens if my belief never grows? We're no different than Judas, just one step away of falling away. That's what happened with Judas. John tells the story of belief, how people come to believe and grow in their belief. Notice in verse 29 of John chapter 20. Somebody read out loud verse 29 of John chapter 20. Blessed are those who have not seen me and have believed. We're going to find in the Gospel of John, we're going to talk about some themes here momentarily. One of the themes are these signs. The signs is to point to the glory of God. So for what purpose? So that he might believe. Right? Well, the sad truth is many do see the sign, and they do believe, but then they fall away. They have a fickle, short-lived, signs-based faith. Their faith didn't grow. And so John shows some people, we'll see in John chapter 9, especially John chapter 9, as well as many other places, the growth of faith. What is, as a matter of fact, when we're reading John chapter 20, who's Jesus speaking to? And when he comes to say that, he's speaking to Thomas, right? Behind closed doors, Jesus appears to the disciples. Many of the disciples, and they see Jesus. The only one that's not there is Thomas. He says, I'll believe it when I see it. Right? So we call him the doubting Thomas. Right? But when he does see it, he recognizes Jesus, and he makes the ultimate confession, my God, my Lord, my God. And Jesus says, blessed are those who do not see me, but yet believe. That's you and I. Isn't it? That's the story of belief that John's going to present. We really want to hit on and touch on oftentimes as we go through the gospel here. So I think the purpose of John is well stated in John chapter 21, or 20 verses 30 through 31. But let's not forget verse 29. 30 through 31 talks about the sign-based faith. That's our initial faith. But our faith grows, and Jesus is blessed are those who do not see but yet believe. That's a growing, mature faith. And John's going to show that throughout his gospel, and we'll see that as we go. There are many themes within John. I don't want to do them all. It would take forever. Forever take a while. I just want to touch on a few of them. One of them is, as we go to the very first chapter, the first 18 verses, which we will hopefully, Lord willing, get to next week. Called the prologue, that is before the words. The prologue starts with, in the beginning was the Word, right? What is the Word? God. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. In the beginning is the Word. It doesn't say Jesus. How do we know it's Jesus? Well, if we move further on, what we're talking about here is the pre-incarnated Christ, the pre-incarnated Jesus. Jesus is God. Philippians 2, verse 5 and following says that he humbled himself and poured himself out and became like you and I. In chapter 1 of John 1, verse 1 tells us that he was the pre-incarnated Word, Christ. I'll get to that in a moment. Look at verse 18. What does verse 18 say? John chapter 1.
No one has seen God at any time. Only the begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father.
My fault, Russ. I meant 14. I apologize.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father.
Thank you. In the Gospel of John, we have very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, that is the pre-incarnate Christ. When we get to verse 14, he is the incarnate. To be incarnate, I had to look it back up, I forgot. Incarnate is the human form. So to be pre-incarnate is before his human form. Verse 14 gives us his human form. And then when we go back to where we were in John chapter 20, when Thomas makes his confession, he says in verse 28, my Lord, my God. That's his post-incarnate. He came into the world. Before he came into the world, he was God, and he was represented as the Word. He comes into the world, he comes in as God, he becomes human form, incarnate, and he leaves and goes back to where? To God the Father. And it's a post-incarnate, no longer in human form, and that's when Thomas recognizes him as my Lord, my God. Let's turn to Isaiah 55, verse 10 through 11. Somebody read 10 through 11 for me. Thank you, Joshua. I notice especially verse 10 sort of gives this analogy or metaphor sample of what he's going to talk to in verse 11. Verse 11, so will my word, what's the word? Message. The message. So will my message, which comes forth from where? From God's mouth. It will not return to me empty. Let's take for a moment and think about the Word. In the beginning was the Word, the message of God, coming from the mouth of God. Does Jesus speak in the Gospel of John often that he has unity with the Father, that what the Father says, he says. What the Father does, he does. He is doing the work of the Father. The unity of Jesus with the Father is very strong in the Gospel of John. And then it says, will not return to me empty without accomplishing what I desire. We have in the prologue and the word, the message, Jesus Christ himself. And this is one of the important things about John. It brings out the divinity of Jesus. He's not just a man on earth. He's not just a prophet. He's God himself. And as we look at Isaiah 55, and it correlates back to John chapter 1, the message of God is Jesus. And he is the one that brings salvation, that brings life. We see throughout the gospel the theme of life. Life that is, matter of fact, it's interesting in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's an emphasis on the kingdom of God. And the emphasis in John, it uses kingdom of God only a few times where there's a discussion with Nicodemus in chapter 3. But the emphasis in John is on life, eternal life. And because it's the word that brings life. And we'll see that especially as we get through John 1, but throughout the Gospels. John amplifies this word, this message, to be Jesus, who is God. And he presents that throughout the entire Gospel. For what purpose? That we would see the glory of God in Jesus' message and his deeds, that we might come to believe. And in believing, we might have life. You see the themes and how they work? It's going to find us throughout. There are many other themes. God the Father mentioned 120 times in John. You think the Father has important emphasis. Several other themes. The I am statements. We won't finish all of our, I'm going to save for why the gospel next week is important to John chapter 1. But several other themes. The I am statements. If you go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where Moses is being sent to the people in Egypt, and he says, well, who shall I say sent me? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent you. Well, 7 times, or 7 passages, actually it's more than 7 times, but 7 passages, Jesus says, I am. Connecting himself to the divinity, and making that connection to divinity, to the monotheistic God, the one and only God. I do want to mention very briefly here, the Jews struggled with recognizing, especially the leadership, for different reasons. A lot because they wanted things the way they were. They didn't want to change. They wanted Messiah to come to give an earthly king. But one of the reasons they struggled to recognize Jesus as God is they believed in the one and only God. Monotheistic, right? Well, how difficult is it for you and I to understand the Trinity? God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. We struggle with understanding. We recognize it, have faith and believe in it. We can make analogies and understand it to a certain degree, but to have full understanding, we struggle with it. How difficult do you think it was for them to understand? With a monotheistic, the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, there's only one God. And now Jesus comes and says, I am. Is that 2 gods? No. That's a hard thing to understand. And they have great difficulty with it. The 7 I am statements, we'll see them as we go through them. Also, we see that Jesus is the one sent from God. One sent to return back to God. Does he return back to God? When? When he completes his mission as Isaiah 55 verses 10 and 11 tells us. And when he completes his mission, his word will not return empty or void. It will have completed all that God desired for it to be accomplished. And he does that. We see also another 7 I am. We also often think about the 7 I am statements where it just says I am. But there are another 7 I am statements where it's I am the bread of life. I am, in John chapter 6, I am the light of the world. In John chapter 8, I am the gate for the sheep. And I am the good shepherd, John chapter 10. I am the resurrection and the life, John chapter, which one is it? 11? Yes, it'd be associated with Lazarus, that's correct. I am the resurrection and the life. When he's speaking to Martha. Exactly right. Thank you. Happy birthday, by the way. And you weren't here. We sung happy birthday for you, but you weren't here. You missed it. And also, I am the true vine, or I am the way, the truth, and the life in John chapter 14. And I am the true vine. We definitely want to study this vine, this true vine. Jesus as the vine, not the church, but Jesus is the vine. And so we have these other 7 predicate statements. Here's the interesting thing about the number 7 is never insignificant in Jewish literature, in Jewish mind. Number 7 is completeness and wholeness. And so we see these 7 I am statements without a predicate, without an object. It's just I am. And it refers to the monotheistic, the one and only God. Jesus was God. Then we have the 7 I am with a predicate. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the gate, the good shepherd, the resurrection of life, the way, the truth, of the life, and the true vine. This is John's giving a divine understanding of who Jesus is, for that we can understand who Jesus is, his Christology. There's the signs, and we mentioned the signs. You know, interesting thing in the Synoptics is that there are the miracles are talked about as miracles, dunamis. But John doesn't use that term. He doesn't use the term miracles. He does one place where he talks about wonders and signs, or signs and wonders. But the focus is on signs in John. Well, what's a sign? It points to something that you're supposed to see, right? Don't look right here. Look at what it's pointing to. That's what a sign is about. And so John does that oftentimes. And what's he pointing to? The glory of God, so that we might believe. And that's what the study of John is going to help us to do. Increase our faith so that we might believe. Next week we're going to look at, I want to look at why this gospel, it's interesting, you'll like it. And then we'll lead into John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Please read that and come to questions and discussions. Thank you.